Hi, my name is Benedict. Today's video, you might have noticed straight away, I'm in Reaper. No, I haven't lost the faith or anything like that. It's just I'm going to be working with a synth which is a 32-bit. And it doesn't work in Reason. No problems with that. You may have noticed that the video title is my first synthesizer. This is actually one of my earlier synthesizers, but it's not about me. It's reference to the children's thing in the sense of this is a primer, a very beginning for people who want to start with synthesis. There are lots of other books, there's lots of other things, and I've written a lot about this. But there isn't always a lot that runs through using a simple synthesizer showing you very simply how it all begins. It's what we'd call a paradigm thing. Now, of course, I am the thinking guy, so I may talk about this, but please don't see that as a bad thing. If you think you're going to learn decades of understanding in 2 minutes, then it's probably not going to work out for you. Now, I've got Synth 1 up. We are not going to work with Synth 1. Many people will say, get Synth 1. Now, in no way am I saying it's a bad synth. There are actually some pretty good things about it. However, there are some problems, especially for a beginner. Number one, it's abandonware. And that's a problem because the way some of the knobs work is just plain ugly. They don't work in elegant ways, and they are prone to getting stuck and doing strange things like this. That's staying there, and like, how do I get rid of it? This is not a thing that I would encourage adding to somebody who's already worried about what the hell's going on when you're adding a couple more layers of what the hell's going on. There are also a few unusual things in the architecture of Synth 1. Now, some of them just plain don't work. Whatever the hell this is, I just think it plain doesn't work. Some of them provide opportunity, but they're probably not opportunities that I would offer to somebody who is starting from the beginning or encourage them to get lost in. So, yes, everyone's going to say Synth 1. I'm going to say, please, don't go there. It's a fine synth, it's capable of doing some good work, but you really need to understand synthesis a little bit better before you go here. Now, you will see many synths that seem more like, let's say, this. This is considered an old-fashioned synth. I made it 10-15 years ago. But you've got your basic structure of an oscillator, another oscillator, a filter, which is our tone control, and some modulation options, an LFO, another LFO, envelopes for controlling things, making shit do stuff, an effect unit, a delay, and then how we handle how things get spat at. It's a pretty simple synth, but through the way some of the knobs are arranged, you can actually do some interesting stuff with it. Again, we're not going to go with this. People say fit serum, massive X, this, that, and the other. Again, massive headfuck overkill. Not a great plan for you. So we're going to get rid of that. We're going to start with this wee fellow here. His name is Pollux. Pollux was designed as a companion to the last synth I showed, Castor, the Greek Castor and Pollux, the twins. Care, don't care, whatever. This was designed to be an incredibly simple synth. It also had the clever design that you could route audio through this guy. So you could have your main synth sound in Castor, you could add another layer in Pollux and filter Castor's output. Ignore that stuff. But it's just if you see those things and you wonder what they're about, that's what they were about. That's why. Now, I'm going to start you on this because it's very simple and it's fairly well in a straight line. First question, what is synthesis? Synthesis, by its name, is the creation of something from nothing or something else. So if we were talking aspirin, used to be white willow bark, then some scientists said rather than hacking down willow trees, or white willow trees every time someone's got a headache, and chewing on the tree, what if we can work out why this works? They worked out what the compounds inside the white willow bark were, came up with it. Oh, it's the salicity thingies, however you pronounce that, the things that dilate your blood vessels. And then they said, well, we can create those chemicals through another process. Synthesis is the ability to create sound through another process. Guitar, clang. That's an acoustic process. Synthesis, it's another process. The process is, if you've got a Model D, a Mini Moog, it is voltages. And voltages lives through basically everything that we still do. We don't need to fuss about them, just know they're there. That is your raw material. The first thing that we've got to think about is tone. The next thing will be time. Time gets trickier. Tone. That's the sine wave. That is the most basic tone that we work with. And you might think, well, that's too boring to do anything with. Well, I've got a couple of answers to you. Everything you hear can be represented with lots of sine waves layered up all over each other. Sounds complex, don't let your head explode, but in theory, everything that you hear can be recreated that way. If you're of the EDM or rap mindset, then the sine wave is the essence of your sub-bass sound, the thing that goes and makes you want to take your pants off. So the sine wave is the simplest waveform. It is drawn as just a sinus wave, like a snake. Up, down, but it's smooth. And so that's why we get this hollow kind of a tone. That's your most basic waveform. You've then got some that are a little more complex. The saw has overtones. Again, we're not going to fuss what the hell overtones are. Basically, they are more sine waves piled up on top of each other. But ignore it. Sawtooth, bright wave. I see. There we go. The other main waveform that we will encounter is a pulse wave. Full, kind of nasal, kind of hollow. So that's a square. Great for basses. The pulse, you can change how wide the up bit is compared to the down bit. And I know some pedantic people say, but you've got to draw a picture. No, bugger that. I might put a picture in somewhere later in the after, but it doesn't matter. What you care about is what you hear. But there's an up bit, which is what makes it bright, the down bit, which makes it not bright. You can change the ratio between the up and the down in a pulse. That's 50-50. That's sort of a 99-1. If you go all the way to 100 to nothing, you get silence. They're your basic waveforms. Everything's a tone. Every sound that you hear has a tone to it, a tone character. But it's a little more complex than that, because it's also got a time element as well. Here, I'm going to use a sawtooth because I just prefer sawtooths because sawtooths are cooler. Sound goes on, sound goes off. As long as I hold that, that becomes the time element. And the way we manage the time element in a sound helps define what that sound is by its role. Very simple time element. The next thing that we would encounter is that very few sounds actually do that. That's actually an artificial thing. Probably one of the first times we heard a sound that turns on, holds infinitely, and turns itself off would have been with an organ, a pipe organ. Before that, such a sound didn't really exist. We would have this. If Mr. Woodsman is hacking away at his tree, there's a controller assigned here. I don't know what that is, but it's annoying, but it'll keep doing it. We will not get ourselves too bent out of shape. Axe hits tree. It's a pretty short sound. It happens instantly. What is that? You see, if we add... That no longer sounds like an axe hitting a tree. Starts to sound more like a wasp buzzing around us. So just the attack and decay, as in time it takes for something to fall back, helps define what the sound is. If you spent much time around music already, then you'll be thinking, oh, that could be piano-y, or it could be guitar-y. Or if we're attached to EDM, then it could be plucky. All these things are defined by a fast attack, as in the sound goes from nothing, not existing, to its full volume, kind of in the instant, and then fades away really fast. So that's kind of like an acoustic guitar string. If we were to... This fellow's monophonic, it only plays one note. They will chop off. So... Guitar. Not a great guitar, but that has the elements that basically match those of a guitar string, an acoustic guitar string. Plucked, instant, decays over time. And that's this shape here. Instant attack, moderate decay, and as long as we're not fretting or stopping that string in any way, decay and release are the same. If I get rid of the release, you see that it hangs on. It gives the full fade as long as I've got the key down. But when I let go, it gets chopped, because you'll see that the release is set to instant. If we put it back up here, doesn't matter whether I hold or don't hold the key, the release is the same as the time it takes for the sound to decay if I hold the key. Now if you have a piano, a real one, with one of them foot pedal things down on the ground, when you press the key, and let it go, or when you press the key and hold it, you get that. The sound holds for quite some time. When you press it and let go, it stops quickly, because you've got your felt hammer that comes up and whacks the string, and when you let go, the felts come in and stop the string from vibrating. However, with that pedal on the floor, you're saying use the hammer to hit the string, get it vibrating, but when we let go of that string, don't engage the felts that stop the string from vibrating. Oh, this isn't monophonic. There you go. Piano sound. Again, in no way am I saying that that competes with some Bösendorfer or multi-sampled set and what have you, and nor should we attempt to do that. If that's what you're after, go out and buy yourself a Bosendorfer. There's only one way to get that sound. Get that sucker in your room and learn to mic the bastard. Have fun with that. You could then use sample sets, but they'll never be the same. Samples and synthesis are not the same thing. There's a relationship, but they're not the same thing. Synthesis is about saying, I'm going to create my sound. So, we've started to get our head around the time element. But what happens now with this piano sound, if I change its tone slightly, still kind of recognizable as a piano, but it's not the same feel, is it? It's feel. Deliberately use that word. It's not the same feel. So we're back looking at tone. But what if we do this? We might just back that back a little. I didn't need portamento, sorry. We're getting to a guitar again, aren't we? What if we did this? We could actually call that a jazz guitar. If you had something like a cheap Porter sound, Yamaha keyboard toy, and you dialed up the jazz guitar sound, you'd get something not a million miles from that. That's what synthesis of sound means. Now again, please do not think that that is a jazz guitar. That ain't Charlie Christian. That is not George Benson. That is not meant to be Charlie Christian or George Benson. At all. Not at all. Not any guitarist you've ever heard of is not meant to be a guitar. We merely add those names to them because it's the role that sound might play. It's a role we might give that sound. When you get really into pure synthesis, then most of the instruments you create have no real name at all, which is why they end up in preset banks having all kinds of strange names. So you can use however you want within your mix, but because it's got some similarity to a jazz guitar, we got to name it something. Get rid of that. Now, so time. Going back to time again, if we add attack now, so our attack and decay and release are roughly the same as each other. They're not the same, but they're roughly the same. Initially we've got kind of an organy sound, which means that we might be still happier to have this sort of thing. But if we brighten our tone, we've actually got a string sound. Now that's probably a slow string. You don't always want your strings to speak that slowly, but if it's a pad, as in you just wanted your violins one to back the main action in your music, then you might well have them fading in that slowly. That's getting into the violin-y territory. It's a bit more of a lead sound, but we don't want all that release. Elements of what makes a violin. So we could call that a violin sound. What we've got is we've got some attack time. A moderate decay, a violin doesn't play forever. If we do this, it's lost its sense of being violin-y. You can do that with bigger string sections. Yes, you would use effects and what have you to fill that out, but that's basic string line. But if we want it to feel violin-y, as in one guy with a fiddle rather than 18 of them, see how we can start to get the feel of, oh, that's a lyrical violin line. Again, this is not meant to, and was never meant to, replace a violinist. But you're creating a sound that can work in that kind of a role, so you give it a recognizable name so that later down the track you don't look at your mix and go, what's the Kazbibi blah 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 instrument do? Because that's like a really dumb thing. There's too much of that. So that basically covers time. There's a million things we can do, and I'll link you to an article where I run through all your basic time shapes here. The next one that we look at, and we'll put that back to basic, is going to be more in the tone arena. We'll go back to our saw. If that's a tone we have to use for everything, it gets a bit, well, go listen to a Porter sound that's been used to make a whole arrangement and you quickly go, oh my god, they all sound really nasal, and it's not, there isn't a variety. So God invented, or actually Mr. Moog, same thing, the filter. What that is essentially, it's a big ass tone control, where on your stereo you may have a bass and treble knob. Turn them up, you get more of, turn them down, you get less of. This is a big ass version of that. Yes, I know, again, don't need to hear from technical people going, blah, 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 blah. It's like, go away, make your own crap, leave mine alone. It's a big ass tone control. What that does is turns down by infinitely ultimately removing everything on the other side of whatever your cutoff point. So here you've got your cutoff point. In synthesizers it might be called a cutoff point, but it'll often just be called filter. What the filter does is based on what kind of filter you've got. Some synths just have one kind of filter and that's it. Don't feel bad about that. It's amazing what you can do with one filter. The more you understand the one filter, the more you can do with the one filter. So don't feel like you need 11 billion versions of filter, because most of the time it's just a spank. So this is just a powerful tone control. In this case, it takes off 24 dB for every octave. So C here, an octave apart. It's saying that everything above the cutoff point, so if my cutoff point's here, it's saying that everything that's above the cutoff point, this way, is being rolled off, as in it's having its volume turned down by 24 dB an octave away. So middle C, C above, at this point, everything above that cutoff point at one octave away has actually been turned down by 24 dB, which is a long way, a really long way. 12 dB is dramatically quieter, 24 dB is noticeably quieter, and then for the octave above that again, it's now 48 dB quieter. 48 dB is basically the average dynamic range of a poor quality listening system. So within 2 octaves, the overtones or the brightnesses of this sound has been rendered unto nothing. It's not literally the way that it works in practice, but it's quite a steep, yeah, just turn that bastard down. That's your low pass filter. You'll see 6 dB, which means that 1 octave up, it's taken off 6 dB of everything above whatever threshold you set, which is here. 12 dB will have turned this point down by 12 dB. 24 down by 24 dB. And that just keeps going. So it's a curve. You can get into things like 96 dB. So between here and here, it has been turned down by 96 dB. They're not musically that attractive. The more you get into the infinite cutoff, the more difficulties you'll have. They can be character filters, and there are quite a few times in my music where I have used actual instant cutoff filters, generally with additive synths, but you get a ping, 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 ping as each overtone turns on and off. So thinking that you need more powerful filter than a 24 dB is probably a sign of you not understanding your filter more than a failure of the architecture of the synth. The 24 dB is a very powerful filter. Between your 12 and 24, you can effectively do everything that you will realistically need. If you really need, there is no reason why you can't add a second filter. And this is generally better. If I wanted let's say a 48 dB roll-off, 48 dB between here and here, that's really aggressive. It would be better for me to use a 24 dB here and then to bring in another filter, which I'm going to be setting at, let's say I set it here, but that second filter, that's what's called a ladder. So we layer them one on top of each other. And in Moog terms, your MIDI has a ladder filter, which is made up of X number of, I believe, 6 dB roll-offs. Technically, maybe wrong, don't care. Again, this is not about you having to learn a lot of science. It's about you merely understanding the basics of what it does. So this filter, as a low pass, it lets everything below my cutoff here, that little red line on the knob slider, everything below that is kept, everything above it is just turned down. Down you go. The other shape that we have is a high pass. So it's doing the complete opposite of what we had before. Everything above the cutoff is kept, everything below is cut off. So if we went 1 octave high and had a 12 dB per octave high pass, then that is 12 dBs quieter below the cutoff threshold than this. Each filter and the way it's built will behave differently, but not necessarily so much, again, that you need to buy millions of devices. Once you understand how your filter works, a filter's a filter's a filter's a filter, broadly speaking. Again, people will get upset with me for that, but don't really care. So low pass cuts off everything above the point. High pass cuts off everything below the point. We've got this band pass. Full marks if you've already worked out what it is, you've been paying attention, and your head's thinking. It does this. Everything above is cut off, everything below is cut off. So you get this. We'll go to 24. As you hear, you get a thin sound, because it's only letting a slice of what's happening here through. So you might think, gee, if I put that on a voice, I'd get that sort of megaphone in a distance sound. Yes, you would. Good thinking. Depending upon your band pass, how it's built, they can be a beautiful filter. But don't rush into them straight away. Basically get your head around low pass. Because the more you understand low pass and how it thinks and feels and what you can do with it, the more you'll understand the other filter types. Okay, let's go back to low pass. So that's our tone control. Now, cue or resonance. If you're looking at a decent quality parametric equalizer, it will have a bandwidth control. So we'll say this band we can add or subtract, and the bandwidth or the Q is how wide we allow that to be. If it's really wide, it's very subtle and musical. If it's really narrow, it's what we call surgical. So if we could hear the freezer over there, if we could hear a hum from its motor and we want to get rid of it, we wouldn't want to use a great big wide band because it's going to take everything with it. However, if we can narrow it down and say, look, that motor is vibrating at 80 hertz, say, and it's very quiet, believe me, it's not a problem, we could create a notch which is quite a narrow and hack it out. So long as we do it well, the average listener won't go, oh look, there's a hole in his sound. But at the same time, they won't be hearing the freezer in the corner. This works on a very similar principle. Very much so if you're using the band pass. It just makes the band pass narrower and narrower until it howls like a banshee. On a low pass, what it does is it amplifies around the cutoff point. So if this here is my cutoff, that's my point of cutoff here, and this is it rolling off. What your Q or resonance does is it actually turns the volume up at this point in a spike or a peak, a tight peak at that point, which means that it emphasizes that frequency. And it does make it start to oscillate and go so far as to self-oscillate on some synths as well, in which case it'll howl. Or upset Reaper, as the case may be, because it was just far too loud. Let's see if we can get this back without breaking the world. How do I get my synth engine back on again? Forgive me, I'm really not a Reaper guy. No, not with that button. There we go, we're back. I think I recorded something. But this is why, and this is my failing, this is why you should have a limiter across your output. Not to mix into, but to stop you from doing what I just did. Your Q will get so pronounced that you can hear it picking out, and I think I probably at this point should add in some kind of limiter. Bear with me whilst I do it. There should be recomp, that should do the job. We want limit output. That saves me the trouble. Actually, we'll leave it sit on that just because we can see if it's doing anything that we need to be aware of. Let's click that. Sorry, and reason I'd have all of this done already. So you can hear there how it's really picking out the frequencies at the cutoff, just as if you had taken a very narrow EQ and said, yep, I want to add 2436 dB of boost just to that area there, and it scans through, which gives you a phasey sort of a sound, a slight element of comb filter. That, boys and girls, is the essence of the acid or TB303 sound. Similarly, the SH101s and the like is just from that really emphasized cutoff point, which gives you that aggressive, nasal, snarky kind of sound, which is really cool when you get it right. If you just do it ad nauseum, it's boring as other things that should not be boring. Now we come back into time element. So we were messing around with tone there, but now we come back into time. We can assign an envelope, in this case the same ADSR style as in our amplifier, to open and close our filter. See, I'm opening and closing the filter without opening and closing the filter. It's magic. No, it's not. It's merely logic. So this filter here, it's been set to sustain, kind of like that organ shape. If we set that to quick attack, quick decay, classic synth-based stuff. If we back it off, another really nice synth bass, because what's happening is tone is starting low, it's being pushed high really fast, and then closing back down again. So if we were to think, well, what was I doing, and to draw this in real time, it would be a lot faster than I can do it, but it would be sound comes on, this goes up really fast, and then falls back down again. See? But that's a pain in the ass to do. You can't kind of get it the same every single time. You can do it if you're good. There are a lot of guys at the moment using electronic wind instruments, so you can control the filter purely with your breath, or you can control it with a foot pedal. You can't see my foot, so I'll pretend this is my foot. You can control it with a mod wheel. Anything you want. But some things just, you don't want to have to be in control of them, because they're kind of a given. So we could set that's turned itself down. Now we're starting to get that piano sound, aren't we? Only it's a bit nicer than what we had before. Damn control. Don't know what that is. 11. Not sure which one's set to 11, but whichever it is, it keeps moving. See how that is in many ways a better sound than this. There's more detail to it. Again, we're not wanting to get into the what's right and what's wrong, but there's a level of detail in this sound now that there wasn't before. And this is important. Remember, we start with tone and we do something in the time domain with it. So in this case, what we've done is we've made it a little bit brighter and then let that brightness fade away. Now, synthesis like this is pretty rudimentary. It's simple, and that has its charms. And a lot of people cannon straight past that, going, no, that's sucky. No, your attitude's sucky. Honestly, if you go into that hole right now and go, the reality is you never really learn your basics. And the more you learn your basics, the more you can do when you get yourself up into an uber synth. So knowing how this works, building this myself, means that if I were now to open up Uhi's Zebra, which is a monster of a machine, or let's say Falcon. A lot of people look at Falcon and they just go, WTF. I can fly Falcon. I don't have Falcon. I kind of half wish I did have Falcon. But I know that I can open Falcon and I could fly Falcon quite successfully straight away. So please don't rush ahead and don't get that I'm too cool for this kind of tood, because I see many people who've been at this for 10, 20 years who started with that attitude and it's limited them tremendously. Don't do it. So you love a thing, no dramas. So the idea here is the combination of several kinds of movement at once, in which case we've got time domain here and time domain here in the tone. Tone and time together means that we get a more detailed sound than we would otherwise have. Passable piano. I'm not going to play Chopin at the opera with it, but it is a passable piano. So understanding how subtly nice little jazz type piano. Don't like jazz, they've been used in disco, they've been used in everything. We could even do this. You're starting to recognize what it is. There's a blind black guy super famous for this sound. Stevie Wonder is a clavinet sound. We can do a pretty decent approximation of a clavinet. With this. By understanding how the sounds work, their basic tone, and how they work over time, we can basically duplicate anything. Yes, with a more rudimentary synth like this, it will be simpler than if I were to do this in Reason's Thor or Europa. However, it's still a workable instrument at this point, and the more you understand that, the better you get. So that's basically tone over time. Let's look at a few of the things that we can do with our tone over time. We'll leave our amplifier envelope basically static through this. We've already looked at kind of piano type thing. Let's go back to our low pass. Fingered precision bass. Overdriven precision bass. Lightly overdriven, played up the neck precision bass. Get rid of that, go here. Precision bass with a pick. Rickenbacker. I know these things because I know these things. And the more you give yourself the ability to know these things, and essentially building a spreadsheet of this is that in your mind, the faster it is. So if you're listening to a sound and you're going, you know what, that's like a P bass played up a little bit further up the neck, not down here where it goes clank, clank, clank like Steve Harris of Iron Maiden, but up here where it's nice and soft and round. Easy. You're gonna go back off our drive here. Brilliant. Now, my personal favourite of basically all sounds, and I use this to test a synth, doesn't mean you have to like it. It's not about you liking it, but brass. Brass is super important in a mix. Now, I understand some of you are going to be saying, this is the cheesiest sound. No, your attitude's the cheesiest. That's a trumpet. Within terms of synthesis, very simple trumpet, very effective in a mix, if you know how to play it. And don't fool yourself, plenty of great jazz guys played synthesizers, either through a controller or through the keys. And they were very intrigued by synthesis and what it had to offer. Obviously it doesn't equal their real horns, but it has something to offer, so don't sort of snark yourself out of stuff. So brass works through having a relatively low build-up of those harmonics. So while our core sound is bright, that doesn't sound like brass. That actually kinda does. Are you going to throw away your symphony orchestra for it? No. But there's another video I've done recently where I'm actually combining synthesis and samples and getting a nicer, richer, fuller sound. If you're at all a fan of Blade Runner, then that feel that came from Vangelis's original soundtrack is synthesizer brass. It's essentially this. A more elegant synthesizer to allow the sound to be more elegant, but that's what it is. Now he's running several oscillators. Little bit of detune. Must have a controller that keeps setting it back. Doesn't really matter. You can play around with detuning oscillators to your heart's content, and I encourage you to do that, to find out what it does, what it adds, and what it takes away. Because if we're after a brass sound, our trumpet, give that a little bit of the old, and we add that chorus, and that stubborn whatever that controller is. Well, that moves the whole synth down an octave. I don't think we can hear that because whatever controller keeps firing here, and I have no idea what it is or why it's doing it. 15, none of these should be firing, but it doesn't happen in reason as far as I'm aware of. Not blaming anybody. It's just, but when you notice with a trumpet sound, which has to be quite direct, if you add a chorus of a pair of oscillators offset from each other, it loses the immediacy of it being a trumpet. You might like the sound, but there's a loss whenever there's a gain. So it's part of why we're not going to get into multiple oscillators. But if you're after a sweep type sound, just about the slow. Again, with effects, this will sound prettier, but I've deliberately not even put a delay on this because I want you to hear what's really happening, not go off into all kinds of garbage about processing and compressing and this, that and the other, because the moment you start doing that, you're no longer focusing on this. I just want you to be able to see the idea that where we've got this really slow thing here, essentially what we're doing is only we're getting the envelope to do that for us. Now, in case you've wondered, drive. You'll see drive on plenty of synths and distortions and what have you. Basically what distortions and drives do is they add overtones. In the extreme, and you may have noticed this before, if we start with this fella here, let's just pull that back. That's our wave. But if we add enough overtones, it will do that. It'll turn into a square wave. Won't matter what we're running, whether we're running this sine, and there's not a lot of drive in this, you'll mostly hear it as volume. It's not an aggressive drive. If you turn the drive up enough, if you make it loud enough, the nice smooth curves here have got nowhere to go. They bang into the ceiling and they become flat. So after a while, your sound becomes essentially a square wave. So that, with enough overdrive, enough volume, will turn into that. This will turn into that. Drive is a way of just adding a little bit of crunchiness, a little bit more in the way of harmonics, because it takes everything that's there and it tends to add extra things, but not necessarily in perfect order. It's a non-linear process, so it kind of messes up your sound, but it does in a way that you can't help but like, until it turns into outright ripping distortion. That's basically it. Now, please do not feel that by watching this you are now a master of synthesis. Not at all. If you've watched this and say that's it, you know everything, and go away, you're not a master of anything other than your own silliness. Sorry if that offends you, but my job's to help you, which means my job's to help point to the holes before you fall in them. What I would hope you would do from here is to say, okay, that's cool, now I need to sit down and practice this. And again, I'll try and put a link down below to show you the mindset, which is that of, and I've shown you here, oh, that's what my envelope would do. Train the brain to see what's happening. Don't feel like you need a synthesizer with little rings that shows you what all the modulation is doing. That's for children. No truly skilled synthesist actually needs those. I'm not saying they're evil, but if you rely on them and you say it's the only way we can, it means you haven't developed this yet. And my method may seem slower, but it's about learning to develop this. Kind of like the Mr. Miyagi thing. Might seem irrelevant, might seem boring and pointless, but then when you go to doing your blocks, you've already got that movement already. So putting in the practice is what I'm really encouraging you to do here, to not sit there and go, oh yeah, I know everything now, because you don't. But to play with it, and very consciously, play with one thing at a time. Don't alter 78 controls and then go, that's cool or not cool, because you don't know anything you've done. One control at a time. That's what that does in that situation. What if I lower this? That's what that does. Now, for a period of time, these things are going to seem a little random. But the more you just practice and put the "that's what that does" into your spreadsheet, then the aha moments where your spreadsheet goes, I can connect that item in that cell with that item in that cell, that's when you're suddenly going, and you can't do it without practice. You may have noticed this little doohickey I've otherwise studiously avoided here. It's an EQ. It's a strange EQ. It's kind of like a bandpass filter. I can't remember which one. So that gives me a really quacky sound to my little brass preset. If I were running a bass sound or wanting to emphasize down there, then I'd simply move it down. This is not a feature on all synths. Some synths will have them, but if you're presented with one band, don't feel like you're being ripped off, because hear the tonal difference between that and that. It's not about right or wrong, merely that it's there. As you see, that's pretty focused on that one note. Okay, so it gets wider as it goes. That's a way of saying, look, I want more energy down there. And please be careful of overdoing the energy down there, because it very quickly makes your mix almost impossible to manage. Your bass you don't want punching at 40 hertz, because it's useless. Nothing can play it. And I don't want to hear about your mate's sub. No one can hear it. So if you want punch, you're better off moving up at least an octave. That's 80. Most people can hear that. And that'll give you punch. It'll push through far better than your 40 will. So if you do have EQs or want to get into just saying, okay, well, I'm going to keep that sound because it's super bassy, man, your lack of overtones will kill you. See, it doesn't matter what we do, we add, yeah, it's loud, but unmixable. And once we get up to the area, a lot of speakers, say a phone speaker, won't reproduce anything below middle C. As you see, we can barely hear that. Levels, kind of in the world of nothing. We have to go down 2 octaves before we can even, seriously hear that in the manly kind of way that we want. So keep your overtones. See, as soon as we add that there, that's punching about here, even though we're playing here. That's why these overtones are so important. If we lift our... Now we can clearly hear that sound up here. You might go, oh, but it doesn't sound like... Of course it doesn't. But if somebody's listening on a phone speaker, that tells them what you're doing. They've still got your bass line. Otherwise, if you've got none of it, they will hear nothing. Literally nothing. I've been sent mixes by people and hear nothing. And they go, oh, what do you think of the bass line? And I'm like, what bass line? There's a great big hole in your track. Did you not write one? And they get all bent out of shape with me. Oh, you mustn't have decent balls. It's like, no, you've seriously not understood what your job is. And that is to make things hearable. That's not hearable. That is. That's not to say this is a great sound for anybody's mix, but it will keep its musical role when listening on a phone or a laptop speaker. And if you think that people aren't... So that's what that thing in the middle does. Ignore it for now. Most synths will have some kind of master section. Ignore it for the moment. When you turn your synth on, focus on the things that we've spoken about. Oscillators, amp envelope, and then filter and filter envelope, in that order. So your basic tone, what that tone does over time, or what that instrument does over time, the volume of it does over time, and then altering that tone, not to improve it, no such thing as improving, merely altering to make it suit what you're looking for. Am I looking for strings, which is going to be lots of bright top end, or am I looking for a jazz guitar, in which case it's going to be quite muted, or bass, which still has to have those mids in its frequency, otherwise it'll disappear off the edge of your mix and people think you didn't even bother writing a bass line. What are you looking for? That's what you're doing. But there will be a master section. Your master section will vary based on each synth, but basically you'll have whether the instrument is... Let's make that a longer sound. Monophonic, polyphonic, several notes at once, poly meaning many, mono meaning one. Retrigger means that it will re-trigger all these envelopes. Let's put this slow. Some synths manage the re-trigger a lot better than others. This isn't doing it super well. A perfect re-trigger means that it will kill the envelope and start right again, which, if you've got a longer attack like this, will be problematic, which is why they've not given you literally what you think you're getting. They will simply carry on from where you were at that moment before, to stop there being a note going along, chopped off, started again. There are some synths that will play it that way, and they're annoying in their own way because they've been too perfect rather than... You can hear it there. It's restarting this envelope, whereas if we don't re-trigger, doesn't matter what notes we play, we don't get that little whoop whoop on the beginning. So each has its advantages and disadvantages based on your style of play. Now, if you're a violinist, you would actually be making those decisions without even particularly thinking about it. It's part of the early technique that you learn, that you would be is very separated notes. That's kind of like solo re-trigger. Once you get that past that stage, hopefully sooner rather than later, because it's bloody horrible, you will be... And that is a legato playing style, which means that largely you're not re-triggering, but you're in a solo. But you would also have portamento, sometimes called glide. So a violinist, they don't have frets on that stupid damn box. They should have made them better. So when they want to go from this note down here on the neck to this note up here on the neck, they've got a couple of choices. They can go which is largely inelegant. Or they can go which can be very beautiful when done right. Not when I do it, but when done right. So that's that. Commonly you'll hear that with a delay, an echo used, which really helps smooth over those little transitions. Now, our playing is not as even as it would want to be for this, but you'll hear how I'll begin a phrase and then play legato when it comes to the next phrase. That little gap means that the envelopes trigger again. So that's what your monophonic and then re-triggering modes with regards to legato and the like are about for playing styles. Personally, I don't love those for my own playing. If I'm trying to approximate a string line, they sound very synthy, they sound very theremin. Nothing wrong with that, there's a beautiful sound, but it's not necessarily what I'm after at the time, in which so I will tend to leave it in poly mode, not always with such a long out on it. And either leave portamento on, which is that way, or simply overlap the keys. Obviously, if you overdo it, it gets a bit nasty. It gets into that kind of approach. It's a playing thing, but that's another way of doing it. You'll often see a bend, a pitch bend. The only part of the synthesizer that my 9-year-old is interested in is this. Pitch bend is used, as I said, we could do that with our violin, fretting down here, sliding up. You need to be a decent player to control that, but that's what it's for. You can control how far it bends. Not every synth does this, but many synths will give you between 0 and maybe 24 semitones, being 2 octaves. That's quite a long way to slide, but don't assume necessarily that more notes is better. It is if you're doing the kind of Gary Newman type thing. That's great. But if you were approximating, say, a guitar, and you wanted to do the string bending, which is where you play a string, twang, and then you actually bend that string, you're stretching the string, so twang, wow. Not the right tone for it, but that's essentially what they do when they do that. So smaller pitch bend wheel amounts definitely have their usage. Lfos. I'm only going to touch one here. You can extrapolate the rest with practice. And that is, we have an Lfo Low-Frequency Oscillator. This is an audio oscillator, and therefore, by definition, a high-frequency oscillator. A low-frequency oscillator oscillates exactly the same. It creates exactly the same waveforms. It just does it a lot slower. So you can hear that. We put our vibrato right the way up. We'll play a note. We can hear that oscillator moving. I believe it's going to be a sine wave, which is that one there. Remember that kind of tone? Depending upon your synthesizer as to how much range you have on that. One of my personal frustrations, they often don't go slowly enough. But that's a reasonable range. Above that we get into audio, and that becomes a version of FM synthesis, which is cool or bloody horrible. It's one or the other, you gotta learn to manage it. But for vibrato... Now let's give ourselves a pulse wave, because it doesn't seem to want to keep turning itself off. That's actually a brass thing. Brass can be made to vibrate that way. That's high speed for a vibrato. So that's what our vibrato is for. Now you can take LFOs, and you can't on this instrument, but you can take LFOs, you can see it on Castor, and you can assign them to things. And I would not encourage you to do this until you've understood the sense and the way that assigning this envelope to this cutoff actually works. When you can understand that, when you can really grok that, then you'll start to be able to understand LFO modulation assignments. If you leap in before then going, but I need my LFO to control my filter, otherwise I won't be able to, be like, yeah, you'll be lost. You will be lost. For decades, maybe. Don't want to do that. Save yourself the time, the heartache. So when that time comes, it's just basically going to be the speed of the LFO, the depth of it being the amount of that waveform, like the volume of that waveform that you're applying to the thing you want to control. So it would be my LFO here, let's say it was slow, and let's say we turned it right up, and we assigned it instead to our cutoff. Easy. Once you can see it in your head, you can program it, you can control it really easily. If you can't see it in your head, go back to basics and understand how here it's making that shape with this. Makes it go up and down by this amount. None. Everything. Some more, less. Seems stupid, and you go, oh, but that's obvious. But it only really sinks in when you've spent the time doing it over and over to go, that's how that goes. Because what happens is it gets complex. Things relate to other things that happen. Let's say we set our envelope here pretty short. Poppy sound. Cool. Pop, 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 pop. But why is my envelope not really doing anything? It should be going pop, not going pop. No, because our attack time here is so slow that this pop has finished popping before this has finished coming alive. So the reason I don't encourage you to jump straight into doing the most complex, coolest thing you can think of is because you'll fall foul of the fact that everything you do in one place is affected by everything you've done in every other place. So tone, you might say, oh, well, I'll choose a square wave because Benedict said, see if that'll stay. No, it doesn't want to stay. And a sine wave because Benedict said they're the most subby sounds, therefore. But you know what? It's still going to be influenced by everything else that you do. If we've got, it's all the same pitch and what have you, but it's not exactly making me want to get my balance on, is it? Because our amp envelope was slow. Part of what you're looking for is that punch. So everything relates to everything else, but an LFO is merely like an envelope, but whereas an envelope does its travel once, unless it's some kind of looping feature, but we'll ignore that, but a basic ADSR just does its thing once. An LFO has its shape, which in this case is a sine wave, but it could be a square wave or a triangle or a sawtooth or a random or a really complex waveform that probably doesn't have a name. It'll just keep going round and round and round, which is the... and it'll do that forever. That's the joy of an LFO. Initially, yes, they were put here just to... give us that sense of movement in a sound, to make them feel less like they were sticky taped into the moment, but you can assign them to anything you want. Get your real understanding here and how the basic bits go together, then you can get into LFOs and you can do cool things. Now, bonus, we will quickly show you some ideas of effects. I've gone through effects in other places, but I think it's only fair if you've gotten this far, let's show you some basic effects. Now, the most basic of all of them is the time effect. Hello. There we go. Let's pull up our synth, put him up there. This device, this effect unit is called time. Oh, look, I made it. Aren't I clever? Because what it does is it picks up our sound and carries it back in time and spits it back out again. Now that's called a delay unit or an echo unit. Delay unit being the more technically correct term. What does a delay unit do? Oh, it echoes the sound. Either is applicable, but officially it's a delay. So whatever I put in comes back out sometime in the future. And if I've got feedback, it appears once. Or sorry, if I've got no feedback, it appears once. If I've got lots of feedback, let's just move that up there. It just keeps spitting that out over and over and over and over again. Now, your very favourite effect, if you can only afford one effect unit, which is really a non-issue these days because your DAW has come with everything you need, and that's really important, your DAW has come with everything you need. You do not need to go out and buy things with Pro written on them. Doesn't mean that they won't be nice, but you do not need them. Back in the old days, things were expensive. Buying a synth like this would set you back hundreds of dollars, if not $1,000. Doesn't do anything, but it still costs you a bomb. Used, it would be $300. It's horrible. Buying an effect unit like this would be a couple of $100 at least, and wouldn't have been as powerful as this, and it would be noisy as hell too. It hissed like a bastard. So back then you often had to budget yourself very carefully. So if you were going to buy one effect because that was what was in your budget in the next 3 to 6 months, you would buy a delay unit, preferably a good delay unit like this one. Because as you hear, you can do all kinds of cool things with them. If you get your time short enough, and no I can't, it's been ages since I've used this, let's see if we can, yeah, too short. This was not really meant for what I'm trying to do here. That's actually a reverb unit now. We can cross over our left to right and our right to left. It's starting to build up on itself and howl a bit. That is now a reverb unit. That's why if you had one device, you wanted a delay unit. That's hideously long. Let's put them back into BPM mode. We won't worry about those. They're a higher end feature. You can control on decent ones, and I'm surprised at a number of delay units that don't have this, but you can control your low and high. So that's a pair of low and high pass filters. So now you'll notice each echo gets warmer or more muted. The other thing this does is that let's reduce our if we go even shorter, which this one just wasn't really designed to do, we've now got elements of chorus. If we were to take hard and stark, turn this back on, fills that sound right out. So if we were to expand that out again, give ourselves some feedback. Our depth is a bit excessive. Actually, I'll go back to using the pulse just because that's going to keep turning itself off and it's annoying. So we can take a very simple instrument and really start to fill it out with effects. But please don't go down the path of adding in lots of effects before you've really got a sense of how to make the instrument work. Because otherwise, you're just kind of putting polish on something that's not right. Some things you achieve with effects and not with the synth, but many things you achieve with the synth and enhance with the effects. This isn't the nicest synth to be making fancier sounds. Maybe we'll pull back in my buddy. Actually, no, let's get Janus. If I can find it. There we go. Let's kill off Pollux. Drag this guy up top. Three oscillator synth with filter and a second filter, filter envelopes, 2.5 LFOs, one which is tied to pitch. Just turn that off for now. And one and the half one's in the middle, which is a sample and hold thing. Presets. Has a weird thing with regards to one of those features that's a bit experimental, works sometimes, doesn't others. So if you've understood Pollux, the little simple guy, then moving to something like Janus or Castor is the way to go. But you will find then there are oddities in the architecture. Architecture meaning the design of the instrument, like this. Oscillator 3 has its own ADSR and can be put into feedback modes. And nasty FM. Exactly how it works fully, to be honest, I've kind of forgotten, but it's a nice synth. Let's try and find ourselves a, there we go, string. So if we're to turn off our delay there and our delay here, that's our sound. If we were to turn off these, you hear how it gets thin, a little like Pollux. The second filter effectively is doing nothing here. This is up fully. There is no filtering effectively. You've got that smidge of LFO, because without it, the sound is kind of thin and flat. The second LFO is not, and 1.5 aren't doing anything. So it's a very simple sound. Nothing interesting happening there, but once we add in this, you can hear the chorusing if we turn that off. Initially the delay doesn't do a lot, it ends up comb filtering, which makes it sound hard and shredded. But once we add then we end up with a nice sound. This second stereo filter merely is a Haas. I wouldn't do it these days, but back then I did. You also have the ability to invert the phase of the delayed signal, which gives you a really huge wide sound. Now that's one oscillator. Put in the next one, it's detuned. That's not detuned. Actually, let's turn off these for the moment. Putting the two together, they're always going to be phase cancellations because this doesn't start each wave at the beginning of each key press, which is nicer than the ones that are tide locked. The ones that are tide locked, like Juno 106s, SH101s and what have you, are great for bass sounds, but the trouble is they always sound the same. So they sound a little like samples, which if you like samples is great because it's a synth that kind of behaves like a sampler. But these are not tide locked, so each the phase. Okay, so if we had our shape, let's say it's like that, that's lined up with my nose. That could be our first oscillator when we hit the key. The second oscillator could be like this. So essentially, they're operating a little like this against each other, and that changes the sound. Those phase cancellations change the sound, just as when we added the delay here without any modulation, we've got those waveforms overlapping each other and they actually started to cancel each other out, which is why you got that funny angular notchy sound. So if we add a little bit of pitch shifting, too much, and we start to get into ugly tone. Not nice. Too much. Whereas 0.02 or 20% is generally nice. We've gone a bit hard here, 30, but you'll see the next one was down to 10. We've got two things happening here. We've got one, we're adding more level overall. That always makes things sound nicer. Louder sounds nicer, which becomes a trap when you're mixing. But we've got those two oscillators out of phase with each other, and they're out of tune with each other as well, which means they sound really thick and you can hear them beating. That adds a rich sound, a bit annoying on its own. You add the third oscillator, and you can hear while they're still beating, it's less and it's more of a so this is what drove the multi-saw, the unison, hypersaw type things. That basic idea. Well, what if we piled up 8 oscillators at once and had them do that? So put this back in. Actually, we'll put it back in with no modulation depth. Again, we've got that phase cancellation, which sounds a bit great in certain situations, but wrong here. Main overall level, but I don't have one. Let's see if we can just pull that fella back a little bit. So that's giving us a nice sound. The delay may be a little longer than I would normally go for now. That's giving it that nice wide sound. We can invert it. It's really questionable wisdom these days. See how we've got the same simple sound, but several versions of it really fattens it up. This is not the same sound, however, you would get if you were to have one oscillator that said, here, let me put you in unison mode. It's not the same sound. So several oscillators versus one oscillator with a unison knob, button, what have you, not quite the same. You've got more control this way. More effort, but more control. Then if we were to bring in our effect unit, that's just spanging because it was holding what it was doing before. We start to get really quite a nice sound. We're not going to worry too much with chorus because I've shown you what a chorus is. It's just a really short delay with modulation on it. I've shown you what reverb is, but we'll look at how it's going to sound because that's more important than anything else. VST, pick S, 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 space. Space is the companion of time. Who named these things? Oh, he must have been a champion fellow. Space was built at the same time as these other instruments. And it's a reverb unit. What it really is a pile of delay units. Each delay in this case is called a tap. Tap, 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 tap. So they've got different levels and different times to them, and also have classic LFO modulation. Sounds a bit woozy on its own. She will kill off that there and that there. So we're just hearing our reverb. Hear how that really fills in. It's not fighting with the main sound. Drag that up. Oh, not there. So if we were to kill that, nice, but it lacks space around it. It lacks some beauty. Now the way that we set up our reverb has a fair amount of impact on what we perceive our sound to be. See how it's called open plane, and that sound seems a lot more open. Twin bloom. Hear how you can hear the first one and then there's a second one? Just what that does. Cathedral. So it's very big, long, hanging reverb, and depending upon how you do it, yeah, how it adds body and warmth to the sound. So we've left the low frequencies alone, but rolled off quite a bit of the highs, which means there's more emphasis in the lows, and you hear them and you feel like, oh, that sound's become, tubbier in the tummy. So if we put our width back in and our the two combine, I'll just slow that down a little bit, and then put in our delay. that, boys and girls, is how you get beautiful sounds. By understanding each part and then adding the next part. Again, my advice is if you just simply go, oh, well, I won't worry about that bit because it's all in the effects, man. It only got sounding good when you put the effects on. You're going to put yourself back by a lot of years, because what you get out is only ever what you put in. So if this is a beautiful sound on its own without any effects, if we were to take a sound that was not quite so beautiful, let's drag this out so I can read. Pop. Oh, nasty piano. That promises nastiness. Doesn't much matter what we add in the way of effects. It sounds more produced, but it's still essentially the same nasty piano sound. So... oh, that inverse. So what is happening here at the synthesizer, at each element of this, is what drives what happens in your effects afterwards. So if you start with a sound that's a bit pathetic, you can only have a shiny, pathetic sound. There are times, as I say, where effects really make the sound, but really work from the idea that you make a beautiful sound here, then you make it a little bit more beautiful here, and a little bit more beautiful here. And that if God came and struck off all your effects, it would still be beautiful. But if God came and struck off all your effects and it would sound like shite, it would mean you're probably not doing your job right, and it still sounds like shite, just polished shite. So, up to you, but before you rush ahead, really spend your time in the core of the instrument. Because if we turn this stuff off, we've still got a good sound there. Like, that's really nice Model D kind of a sound without any effects having to be flown in. As soon as we fly them in, a bit overdone perhaps, then we're building beautifully on what we had. This is a complex thing. It is going to take you time. So again, please do not rush. You might want to watch this over again. I'm going to aim to put a couple of links down below for you, which are primers. They cover what we've done already. But that's for you to go away and practice, to turn those knobs, to go, okay, when I assign an envelope, effectively what it's doing is this to the, say, filter knob. But I don't have to do it myself because this will do it for me. And then to see how all those parts come together so that you can start to make good sounds with a really simple instrument. Now, everything I've shown you here, those devices of mine, they are free. I will give you a link that will let you go through. There are a couple of hops to get there. That's deliberate because where they are is prone to changing over time. There is no cost in them. Yes, they are 32-bit devices, so they won't necessarily work in everything. If they don't work in your DAW, no shame. There's probably some other instrument, but the reason I chose Pollux was because we weren't looking at 50 million knobs, we were just looking at the bare few. If you do find yourself picking up a more complex instrument, put aside all the knobs that are not relevant. Just put them aside, forget them, ignore them, put them into a 0 setting where they're not affecting what you're doing. Turn off the second and third oscillator. Get rid of them. Because learn to make a great sound to get the things that you want with the one oscillator and the one filter. And then, once you know, oh, that's how I do that, rather than thinking that you need 300 oscillators and 27 filters and 48 layers of distortion and compression to actually get a sound, you'll realize, the fundamentals of that are right here, in that one oscillator and the one filter, and 1 or 2 envelopes. And then when you've got the power to have many oscillators, many filters, drives, compressors, what have you, then you're going to use them wisely and you're going to get a bigger sound. Any questions? Please ask down here. I know it's been a long one, but they're always a long one. That's the nature of this. I warned you that going in. But there may well be questions, and you can watch the video again. You can keep watching it over and keep practicing, and you'll notice that you go faster than other people. You have a great day now.